So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Matt Carmichael, SVP, Consumer Trends Thought Leadership. Matt, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Welcome to the US edition of Ipsos Global Trends. As Ellen mentioned, this is the 9th edition. We've been doing this since 2014. It is Ipsos's largest public research project, and we are pleased to present the results to you today. We want to start with a series of signals of continued shifts in these trends that are also kind of reactions to the trends that we're going to talk about today. And that doesn't mean the trends are somehow dated because there are already reactions. It means that these are legit trends, and those don't happen overnight. They build over time. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how to think about trends. My colleague Jennifer is going to take you through the framework of global trends. We have 9 that we have established, and I'm going to then zoom in on 3 of those trends as they are kind of uniquely American in how they're playing out. So here's some things, though, that we've just seen in the news in the past couple of weeks that really are bringing some of these trends to life. So our splintered society trend that we'll talk about is colliding with our climate convergence trend as automakers are prepping in the US for an EV slowdown as tax incentives start to expire. But they had a record Q3 in EV sales as those tax incentives were still there and people were trying to take advantage of them. We saw signs of our nouveau nihilism as GoFundMe, the crowdsourcing fundraising platform, is now being used for people to pay for everyday food and everyday costs like buying groceries in what I'm starting to call our trickle sideways economy. We see globalization fractures on full display, with the US taking an outsized role in deal making in tech companies here with like NVIDIA, Intel, and TikTok, and also abroad as the US pressured a Dutch chipmaker to oust its Chinese CEO. And we also see these social media ads popping up about companies claiming they're having going out of business sales, even though they're not actually going out of business, but they're using that as a way to market themselves as a reaction to tariffs, that the tariffs are forcing them out of business. But if you go to the website, they're actually perfectly healthy, which is an interesting signal. And we see our techno wonder trend and the wonder and the worry as AI and CEOs are pursuing and also calling out that they're making AI-related staff reductions. We saw a big one of those in the news last night. And so in this backdrop of uncertainty, it's not perhaps surprising that the US is losing some of its personal optimism. One of the biggest shifts we saw in global trends throughout the world was a 7-point drop in optimism on the personal and about our city and towns where we live. But in the US, that's twice as big. We had a 15-point drop, an even more stark change just from last year. As Ellen mentioned, my name is Matt Carmichael. I'm an SVP of Consumer Trends and Thought Leadership. I oversee the US Consumer Tracker. I'm the editor of our monthly foresight magazine, What the Future. I also am a co-author of Global Trends with Jennifer Bender, and I will let her take it from here.
Thanks, Matt. In my role as the head of Global Trends and Foresight for Ipsos, this certainly has been a study that we have spent a lot of time and love on. The other hat that I wear is as an associate partner in the Strategy 3 practice, which is our consultancy within Ipsos, where we apply a lot of the trends that we'll be talking about and really dive into the macro forces that we'll be touching on today and apply them to our clients' business challenges. So we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation today, and we'll have some time at the end as well. So feel free to post your questions in the chat, and let's dive into it because I think there's a lot to cover today. So we think the most important thing to think about when we're talking about trends, and this is especially true of our trends study, is that it's not just about looking at how consumer attitudes and values are changing. That being said, that is a core part of what formulates our study and really the underpinnings of it, in the sense that we have millions of data points to be able to parse and to analyze. But we're also looking at change from a number of different levels. In addition to that consumer perspective and how things are shifting in society, in people's attitudes and behaviors, we're also looking at those big macro forces. What are the big 5 to 10-year shifts in how the world is changing around us, from everything from technological change to economic environments, and how is that in turn impacting the way that consumers feel. We also look at change from the very micro perspective. So looking at signals, could they be something that comes up on social media? It could be something that is a new innovation or a new way of coming to market. And we look at all three of these together as trend experts and as the authors of the Ipsos Global Trends study to really look at how they're interconnected and how they fit together to help us understand change. Now, on the next slide, there are many, many more macro forces that we can dig into. We won't go into all of them today, but just know that this is an amazing tool for you to be able to tap into with your teams, and we're happy to dive into with individual clients to really look at how the world is changing around your market, around your category, and around your consumers and how they're reacting. What we'll spend most of our time on today is the global trends. So in the next section, we have a preview of 6 that are evolving, and then we'll go into a little bit more depth on 3 that are really, really unique for the US and give a snapshot of what is changing over time. So in the past year, we've developed 9 different trends, and all of these have been updated and refreshed over the past couple of months as we've been parsing through all of the data of our attitudinal study. And the first one that we want to touch on is about globalization fracturing. And this really is a continuation of something that we identified last year in the sense that it's very much about a questioning of whether globalization is good and bad. And part of this is a reflection of the elections that happened around the world last year in the fall that really represented a changeover in leaders and favored a lot of new leaders over incumbents. So it's been a lot of this changing of the guard that's reflective of globalization fracturing as well. But citizens are really starting to question the value of globalization while political leaders are leaning into this and trying to navigate rapidly evolving tensions. So what does this mean? In terms of the attitudes, we're starting to see a clear distinction and an inclination towards buying local, and a lot of people who are really interested in this element of national pride and formulating perhaps more trust in local goods and services. And the reason that we call this out is we think this is a paradigm shift and a dynamic that's starting to grow, that people are much more interested in local goods and thinking about the impact of their purchases and the impact of their contributions to the economy. But at the same time, on the next slide, we have a similar kind of data set in terms of looking at how consistently people generally feel, over half of them in the US, that globalization is still good for their country. So even though there's this kind of push towards localism, there's still this general agreement that globalization is good. And as we get into the details of that, we looked into a little bit more in depth about trade barriers. And we certainly see that, this is very different when we look at different markets. And even in North America, views are really mixed. So despite US tariffs, only 37% of Americans and 41% of Canadians support more trade barriers, while a majority of Mexicans favor stronger protection. So interesting to really see how this is playing out, even amongst the trade policies that have been enacted this year by the administration. So in terms of how this is playing out with brands, a few signals of change that I think are important. One is that we're starting to see a lot of global brands starting to dial down those global legacies and even potentially dial down their Americanness and start to look at talking about how they are enacting change and how they're having an impact in local markets. Coca-Cola did this notably earlier in the year, really dialing up their messaging about how their local operations and the nature of their business really has an impact on local economies. The other side of this, of course, is national brands. This example from relaunching HO in Mexico. National brands being really looking at a source of pride and government starting to support that sense of pride. So it's a reflection of everything that's happening in the environment around us and a reflection of these increasing geopolitical conflicts and trade wars. But certainly interesting to see how this is trickling down and how brands are reacting. The next trend is around splintered societies and very related to globalization. But this is not just about the political environment and about this push and pull of globalization. It's certainly part and parcel of political perspectives. And we see that reflected in immigration being one of the measures where we see the most year-over-year change and a lot of debate about the role of immigration and immigration policy. But there's much more to this in terms of how people are thinking about disparities and how people have differing opinions about the role of government in their lives. And in fact, we see this reflected on the next slide in a large percentage of Americans saying, you know what, we're seeing a lot of inequality, not just in our communities, but even within our own families, that nearly half of Americans feel that there's more and more conflict within their family amongst relatives who don't share the same values. So could be a very interesting holiday season around the dinner table this year. That being said, we think that brands have a role to play as well. And part of this is a reflection of this increasing sentiment that people really strongly, are even more so than when we started asking this question in 2013, feel that having these big differences in society, this example being differences in income and wealth, are not good and that we need to solve some of this. At the same time, we see a lot of people, 3/4 of the population, really feeling that businesses have a role to play in solving some of these issues and that they have a responsibility to contribute to society, not just make profits. So it's an important question for brands and businesses to really start to think about how do we bridge those divides. One of the hot button topics is on immigration, as we mentioned, and this certainly is something that we've seen change year over year in the sense that there are levels of concern about the impact on the economy, the impact on jobs, and it certainly ties into that sense of globalization fracturing. But whether or not this is coming to fruition is certainly very different across different perspectives throughout the world. And I think it's interesting too, as we look on the next page, to think about, despite all of those differences, where can we help consumers start to find areas that we do agree on? So despite all of this being driven by macro forces like increasing diversity, systemic inequalities, how can we find areas that people generally agree on? And it may be by avoiding some of those hot button topics, but also looking at what are those consistent values that people do support, and how do we support people who in particular are really in need of it. So some examples here around financial inclusion is that certainly top of mind for a lot of our clients, but also thinking about, breaking down some of those assumptions about who is receiving support and who isn't. That's really interesting to look at how this is coming about in the world. So on another hot button topic, even as of this morning, climate change. The reason that I think this is coming up, we've had clients asking about this, given that the announcement this morning of Bill Gates starting to dial back some of his commitment to climate change is prompting a lot of questions, and we'll come back to that at the end for a bit of a discussion. But I think this is really important in terms of thinking about how our attitudes toward climate change shifting over time. And what we've seen is that in the course of our study, more and more people are in agreement, the convergence piece of this, more and more are in agreement that climate change is a concern. And we're starting to see that this is broadly true and broadly increasing over time. At the same time, however, we see a large proportion of Americans saying, you know what, I'm already doing all that I can to save the environment. So that's really interesting to break down into a generational lens as well, in the sense that on the next slide, we have a breakdown of, boomers all the way to Gen Z. And it's a distinction here that, older generations do feel more strongly that they're already doing everything that they can, whereas younger generations, and particularly Gen Z, aren't necessarily quite there yet. So it's reflective of what we've been seeing in culture and in social media as well, is that younger generations do feel that there's more that they could do. But there's also this realization broadly amongst Americans that, there are other elements at play. There are government interventions and policies that need to be set, and that there's a role for corporations and brands to play as well. So how this is coming about in terms of signals is really that broader understanding of government action is certainly coming to bear. The example here being Australia creating the first ever climate visa for citizens who are trying to escape climate change and a very real existential threat. But at the same time, there's a lot of innovation happening in terms of industries and individual brands really trying to make sustainability both more appealing and more fashionable. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in terms of brands really leaning in, as well as the government role in terms of solving for this as well. The next trend is around conscientious health, and this one is certainly near and dear to my heart in the sense that I think it's reflective of what a lot of Americans have been seeing and feeling over the past decade since we've been studying this. And it's really been about this merging of health consciousness and a seeking of control, and that merging happening to be more holistic. So we're not just looking at health from a physical perspective, but we're increasingly looking at health from a mental and social perspective as well. And the biggest change that we've all seen in the headlines over the past year since we started this trend is certainly around GLP-1s and the very real fact that a lot of Americans still feel that they would like to lose weight. So there is still this big focus on physical health and on physical fitness, and looking to solutions to help us achieve those goals. But on the next slide, this is really balanced by this equal desire, I would say, to focus on mental health. So we've seen a gap starting to close, and now physical and mental health are almost neck and neck in terms of how important they are to Americans. On the next slide, I think it's important to keep in mind too that this is something that we've seen happening around the world, that this closing of the gap and the importance of mental health rising over time may be different in different markets. But just as in the US, consumers around the world are starting to see that mental health is just as important and is increasingly something that they need to focus on, in particular to think about their holistic health and how that really impacts their physical health. So as that gap is closing, it's certainly something for brands to think about. How do you solve for both sides of that equation? The big question I think that's coming about for a lot of brands over the past couple of years is, with increasing focus on physical health and increasing usage of drugs like GLP-1s, what does that mean in terms of our brand strategy, in terms of our category strategy? You know, is it something that will continue to be determined? But there's a lot of promising research coming out, and certainly more versions of the drugs coming out, and may mean that we have a bigger focus on physical health, even more so than before. That being said, we expect that there will still be a big focus on additional frontiers and the holistic view of health, sleep being one of the biggest ones in terms of research, and certainly a growing desire for disconnecting from technology and disconnecting from the fast pace of life. So lots to explore here in terms of opportunities for brands. The next trend, I think, is one that we've felt very strongly here in the US, and this is not just a reflection, this idea of retreat to old systems is not just a reflection of nostalgia, although that is part of it. It's much more something that we've seen especially come to life in the 2024 election, but that's just one example of how this is really coming to life. And it's certainly something that we've seen come to life in places like the Manosphere, in the Tradwives trend, but also a big questioning about, you know, were we better off yesterday than we are today? And the question becomes, you know, what are we really yearning for? What is it that we want to go back to? On the one hand, a lot of people say, you know what, I would like the country to be the way that it used to be. And that's true not just in the US, but in many countries around the world. But at the same time, we have to realize that there's this truth that the past wasn't necessarily good for everyone, and that we've made a lot of progress since then. So interesting to look at how different perspectives are about whether we go back to traditional norms or not. As we think about the impact of this, you know, there is a real impact looking at policy changes and how political rhetoric affects this as well. So particularly when we're talking about increasing sense of gender identity and how that has been expanding, there's also this pullback. So it's definitely a reaction to, not just in the US, but in many markets around the world, this pullback of, you know, maybe we've gone too far and we don't necessarily all agree that this is the right way to go. And this is happening not just in terms of gender identity, but in a lot of different spheres of life. And in fact, in the US, we've seen that younger men in particular are even more conservative. So it'll be interesting to see how these gender roles play out. And we certainly see a lot of that coming to fruition in terms of US policy, but also in terms of brands taking a stand and trying to figure out the right way to navigate what effectively is a really tricky tension about the way that we should be moving forward, whether we should be moving toward things that we've been used to in the past. So the last trend that I'll talk to you before we dive into a little bit more depth on how things are coming about in the US, and Matt will go into some detail on that, is about the power of trust. And this is one that we've been tracking for a long time in terms of the decline of trust in institutions. But at the same time that there's been this decline in trust, we do start to see that there is an increase in trust toward individuals. So what that functionally means is that brands really have a role to play in terms of really feeling much more relatable, but also reflecting their consumers' personal values. And this has become much more important over the past 10 plus years that we've been studying it. At the same time, we start to see a lot of real expectations in terms of people placing their trust in products that they know. They know that the value is there. They know that the quality is going to be there. The trust is really placed in brands that they know and love. And yet at the same time, going back to our earlier comments, they also feel generally that it's possible for brands to support a good cause and make money. So it's not just about reflecting their values, but really putting their money where their mouths are. We start to see that this is also important in terms of where people are willing to spend. And this is an increasing upward trend line in our study that many people around the world, and Americans included, are really willing to spend extra for a brand. So it's not just about the brand really reflecting your values, but it's also about the public value of that. What is the badge value of the brand? What kind of values does that represent to your peers and to the public? All of this really comes out to play when we think about the role of brands in instilling trust. And they can certainly play more toward the institutional side of large global brands, but they can also play more to the personal side if you think about how brands can really be relatable, how they can use local connections, how they can drive trust, as this example here from Mexico lays out. But it's also about how do you really lean into the individuals within your products, within your brand ecosystem, to really play that individual role and to help connect to your consumers on that one-to-one level. So lots to think about here in terms of the implications from our global trends, but I'll pass it over to Matt to talk a little bit more about some particularities in the US that have a uniquely American spin.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for taking us through all of those great trends and that great framework. And I think it's especially interesting when we start to see the places where those trends start to intersect, and we'll talk about that more a little bit as we go. I'm going to take us through 3 different of the trends that Jennifer hasn't covered, where we're seeing a really uniquely American spin. And of course, as Americans, we like to think that we're special in all of the trends, but here are 3 that we're really going to dive into. And I'm going to bring in a bunch of data from outside of Ipsos Global Trends as well, of where we are seeing signals and shifts in our other data, like the consumer tracker, like in What the Future. So I want to start with, I think, one of the most unique, which is the techno wonder trend. And this is a trend that's built off a really central tension, that if we ask around the world, do you think technology is needed to help solve the world's problems? And we've heard from a lot of the problems today about income inequality, about health and wellness, about climate, about globalization and polarization. Technology is needed to solve those problems. The majority of people around the world agree with that. But a majority of the exact same humans also agree that technological progress is, quote, destroying our lives. So that's a really big tension. We've been writing about this for several years as this tension between the wonder of technology, that it can help solve these problems, and the worry of technology. And in the US, we are much leaning harder into the worry. So whereas 71% of people in the world think that we need modern technology to solve problems, only 56% in the US do. Whereas a majority of global citizens think that AI is having a positive effect on the world, in the US, where a lot of these technologies are being championed and developed, only 39% agree with that. And if we turn to the Ipsos Global AI Monitor, which we've been running since before the kind of big launch of ChatGPT, so we have a trend line going back before that, we see the world kind of breaking into 3 or 4 different spheres. In some of the developing economies and in Asia and in parts of Latin America, there's a very positive view on things. Partially that's due to the way we ask the questions on Global Advisor, which is an online survey. So there's some effect of that there. But there's also, if you look at Europe, they're kind of split between being nervous and excited. And in the Anglosphere, and in the US particularly, we're much more nervous and much less excited about all of these technologies. This year in the AI Monitor, we added a question about trust in the government to regulate. And here, again, the high trust countries are a lot of the same markets that we're really excited. But the US is both low trust and nervous and makes us a very big outlier in terms of how we are looking at all of these technologies. And I would say that Ipsos is really leading the world in terms of measuring public opinion and response, human response to all of these technologies. We've been asking all sorts of different questions coming at this from a lot of different angles. And when we look at if people trust AI or trust the humans or trust both, for a wide range of activities that AI is already doing, things like evaluating new medications or screening jobs, or even just people using it to plan their vacations. In no cases do we trust the AI to do that more than the humans. But in all the cases, we trust AI plus human intelligence more than just the AI itself. That's really important. And this year, we also added a question where we asked people to choose. We gave a forced choice question about the worry and the wonder. And people overwhelmingly chose the wonder. And that's part of it. There's a bit of nouveau nihilism in here as well, that we don't necessarily trust all of these tools. And we see in the consumer tracker that we're concerned about privacy, but we also just think we're being tracked everywhere. And so we use all of these tools anyway, which again leads us right into nouveau nihilism. This is kind of one of our favorite trends. We see this achievement gap, and this trend has been called a bunch of different things around the world. It's been called the sod it trend in the UK. It's kind of the F it trend in the US, pardon my French. And please pardon the French, because the French colleagues would point out we're not using the French exactly correctly here. But this is a really interesting trend about this generational disconnect, that we have all of these traditional milestones, and in the US, they've gotten farther and farther apart and harder to achieve. And we're doing them later in life and differently and to different degrees. So we're getting married almost a decade later than we used to. We are having kids almost a decade later than we used to. Fewer of us are able to buy homes at younger ages. So all of these life milestones, and retirement is getting pushed off as well, aren't happening when they used to. And that's leading to this kind of spirit and this sort of little bit hedonistic, a little bit nihilistic, that we're just in this really uncertain time. And therefore we should live for the future, either because it's going to take care of itself or because it's uncertain. And those two things are really impacting how we spend and how we save and how we dream. We have a huge decrease, as I mentioned kind of at the top, in terms of our optimism. And when you couple all of these things together, you wind up with a world where we are trying to live for today because we don't feel like we know where tomorrow is going. And 70% feel that our government isn't prioritizing concerns of people like me. So this trend often, or in a lot of ways, is coming out of things like the split in societies and the globalization fractures and those macro forces about trust and broken systems. And the US is certainly not alone in this. We're actually kind of middle of the road in terms of the live for today because the future is uncertain. But in almost every market, there's a majority and a increase in this sentiment as we go. And one of the fascinating things about this trend for me is that while we chose to illustrate it with a young guy sitting on his couch playing video games, most likely in his parents' basement that he had to move back into, I say as a parent of high schoolers, it's coming, we don't actually see any difference really in terms of any of the demographic shifts. So we see this in terms of all generations. It's not just a problem for younger people. And in What the Future, we did an issue earlier this year about the American dream. And we asked people what they're dreaming of and what they're hoping to achieve. And also we asked them, of those things, how close do you feel to achieving them? And across all of these different life milestones about just being healthy and our conscientious health trend, about having financial security, about being able to afford a home, about retirement, we see that most Americans don't think they're close to achieving those goals. So we have this achievement gap here that is leading us into this feeling of nihilism and these feelings of hedonism, because at all of life's life stages and all of life's milestones, we don't feel like we're going to get them. And then the final trend. Remember, we started really broadly with globalization fractures, which is literally about how world markets are shaping and changing and how that's infecting all of us on Earth. But as we go through the kind of narrative arc of the 9 trends, it comes back down to the individual. That as we feel that things are out of control, as we feel that we want to retreat to an earlier time and earlier systems, as we feel this lack of trust in these systems and in our governments and in our leaders to really take us and face the challenges that we are facing, we start to focus in on the thing we can control, which is ourselves and how we show up in the world. And back to nouveau nihilism a little bit, as we're thinking about how all of these different milestones fit in, younger Americans, the Gen Zs, now consider owning their own home to be a luxury purchase. So when you start to think about how we spend today, what we spend on, how we save and what we're saving for, if we're not saving for a down payment because we don't think home ownership is within our grasp, that really starts to change the financial picture for not just younger people, but how those people will advance through time. And we kind of think we're on our own and that we should be on our own. Vast majority of Americans think that it's up to everyone to work out their own principles to guide their decisions. And how we are doing that and how we are defining what is important to us is also shifting. So now only about half of Americans feel that fulfillment in life extends beyond achieving a prominent part or place in their career, which is often for previous generations been a huge banner and badge of success, right? That you have succeeded in the corporate world. But now most feel that it's more important to have a good work-life balance than just a successful career. And we're not defining success by the things we own. And that could be due to a simplification of life as we age and we have an aging population. But it could also be economic. Half of Americans, according to the Consumer Tracker, have no money left over after they pay their bills each month. So we don't necessarily have those things we can splurge on all the time to help define us. And so we lean into other ways of indulging, that smaller indulgences can be just as meaningful as purchasing a high-end product. This is from WTF, What the Future, our indulgence issue, which is the webinar will be on Thursday. If you want to join me for that, I will take you through that whole issue about luxury and about affluence and indulgence and about vice. Lots going on in that issue. But as it comes into here, we see, again, we're redefining what it is to be in the world and what it is to experience and how we define and shape our own values and ourselves. And back in the American Dream issue, again, we were talking about the components of the dream. And so while we often aspire to the same milestones, we don't necessarily think we're going to achieve them. And that's been really different from generation to generation. So baby boomers see homeownership as super important and personal freedom a little less so. And Gen Z completely flips that script. 3-to-1, they say that personal freedom is an important component of the dream compared to homeownership. And again, that totally changes how all of this comes into play. It might be that, again, they don't think they're going to be able to achieve that. We see a lot in our data about young men wanting fast and easy money and passive income. So again, different goals, different aspirations. But the biggest trend line we see in Global Trends from when we started this in 2013 is the role that brands play in all of these conversations. That we want to buy things from brands we trust and brands that align with our personal values. So how your brand shows up in the world is just as important to people as how they show up. And they're using brands and the things they purchase, not only to define themselves, but also to show that off to other people. And they want to find that alignment with the values and find those common values for themselves. So I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer at this point, and she's going to talk you through how to take all of these trends and bring them to life for yourself and your business and your organization. Jennifer, back to you.
Thanks, Matt. And that's really, I think, the prompt that we wanted to leave all of you with is these are really just very introductory senses of the trends and something that we hope that you'll use as tools. There are a few different ways that we suggest that clients can use these, and we're happy to answer questions for anyone who would like to go through them in more depth. The 3 ways that I would think about using them right off the bat is first to think about using the full report. So what we've shared with you is just a snapshot of a few snippets here and there from the US report. So we've customized what is available to you. So number 1, I would say go read the full report and use that with your team. So really think about using it to infuse into your innovation sessions, using it as an input into your strategic planning. We've done a lot of presentations for clients and boards actually in the past couple of months. So I think that's number 1, is to use all of that data that's publicly available to you. The other thing that I would say is that we have all of the updated macro forces, which are not in public reports, but those are certainly something that we can use with clients and apply them to your business challenges as well. So how do you look at the world that's changing around you and then infuse that into your strategy to make sure that it's future-proof? So that's really tool number 2 that you can use. And then number 3 is we've barely scratched the surface of the data that's available. You know, we could stay online talking about this for hours, but know that there is a lot more that we can dig into, a lot more slicing and dicing that we can do, not just within the US, but also looking at comparisons across different countries and different demographic groups. So just know that that is available to you as well. And all 3 of those and much more can certainly be done to answer very specific business questions. But in the interest of time, we've actually had some good questions coming in on the chat. So we'll switch over to that. And certainly we'll have some time to answer these. If we don't get to your question, feel free to pop it in the chat regardless, and we'll come back to you by email. But Matt, one of the things that you landed on that I want to pitch back to you is this question that came in toward the end when you were talking about brand's role and how closely brands need to align to consumers' values. The question is, what do you think businesses can do to contribute to society that benefits their reputation and the bottom line?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. That's, a nice softball to start with. So, I think that we are living in a very complicated market in a very complicated time for that market, and that it's really incumbent upon brands to understand who their customers are and what their customers value and how that aligns with their own mission and where those points of commonality are. The good news is there is a lot of commonality. A lot of the things we talked about, both in Global Trends, but also in the American Dream issue, are things that are believed and shared by large percentages and large majorities even of the population, regardless of demographic splits, regardless of party affiliation. There is a lot of common ground to lean into. But it's also important to realize that there's also a lot of fracture going on at the same point. And so for every company, for every brand within a company, that's going to be a little bit different depending on who their customers are and who they're trying to reach. And I realize this is going to sound self-serving, but the real answer is you just have to listen to them. And you have to listen in as many different ways as you can. Some of it's going to come out in qual, some of it's going to come out in quant, some of it's going to require some ethnography, some of it's going to require social listening. All of it's going to require being updated because a lot of these things are shifting. And there are certainly stories, I'm not going to name names, but you can find them, of brands who have wound up in a tricky place through no fault of their own, just because it is a tricky place to be in America today. So always be keeping an eye on the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the other thing is really being true to what your brand stands for and making sure that, you know, you're in line with your values as a brand that you've stood for, and that you're solving for the same kind of tensions that make sense. You know, not every brand necessarily needs to make a stance on everything. So really taking a hard look at what you stand for internally and making sure your house is in order in that sense as well.
Yeah, and we see that in the data ourselves, that while taking a stand is important, sticking to that stand is even more important for everyone. And that backtracking on something that you've already done is often seen as a bigger problem than not doing it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of ties into the second question. Speaking about a reversal on a stance, I mentioned up front, and we got a question about it, about the news this morning that Bill Gates is dialing back on climate change. The question is he really dialing back? Now, this is a bit of a supposition. Is he really dialing back, or is he saying that other things also matter, that people's health, living standards, and poverty are affected by climate change? We've been getting some great questions. I can take a stab at that one, and then, you know, Matt, I would love to hear your perspective as well. I think the point, and granted, this is fresh off the press this morning, but I think from what I've read so far, the point that he is making is actually related to globalization fractures and some of the nationalism and protectionism policies that have been made by the current administration have impacted the ability to fund different initiatives, such as combating poverty standards and low standards of living. So the point that he was making was more so there are bigger problems now arising because of that pullback on funding that's happening. And certainly that's interrelated to climate change, but not exclusively driven by climate change. So I think he's making a choice there about what are the bigger systemic and societal things that we need to cover, but it's not just related to climate change, there are bigger issues at play. So maybe it's that he's shifted responsibility, seeing responsibility shift away from a government policy more back toward NGOs, like his foundation. But Matt, I'm curious for your take on the news of the day.
Yeah, and I'll just acknowledge, we're going to go a little over time because we have some good questions here. If you really do have to leave at 45, that's fine. This will be recorded and you will get a copy of the recording. But in terms of the question about Bill Gates and climate change, the headline was that climate change will not lead to humanity's demise. And I think that's probably a pretty terrible baseline, right? That maybe we should be doing a little better than just, it won't kill everybody on Earth. So I think, Jennifer, to your point, like, yes, he is talking a lot, especially about his own priorities, that as the US has pulled back from a lot of our support for the kind of initiatives that the Gates Foundation has always supported, that used to be done through US aid, that he just needs to refocus his own priorities and his own fortune on continuing to fight for a lot of the things that he has fought for. I think he also sees that humans are resilient and that we probably will somehow adapt to some of the things, and we already are adapting to some of those things. And I think younger generations don't know what used to happen. Like, kids who are being born today don't know that in winter in Michigan, we used to have sledding all year round, and now you only get to sled one day because it doesn't snow as much. Like, these are things that have happened just in my lifetime. And I think we've been kind of insulated from a lot of that because we are adaptable. And to make an analogy, we're seeing that sort of with tariffs at the moment, just in a very short-term horizon, that corporations are absorbing a lot of those costs and not passing those on, and people aren't feeling those changes. And I think that is going to start to change. Companies are going to have to address their own bottom lines and pass that on, and costs will go up. But in the same way, climate change is still coming. It's still going to happen. Climate models have been very accurate in terms of predicting where things are going. And as more and more people start feeling that day in and day out, I think we'll see that climate change is still a really big priority for a lot of people who don't want humanity's demise.
Well, hopefully, yes, that is the case, that a lot of people are aligned with that. Maybe one last question here, because I think this is a good one and something that you kind of cued at the very, very beginning. A lot of companies have announced layoffs and reductions in force around AI. Amazon is one example of that, but there have been many others. how much of that is really AI related and how much of it is actually related to some of the other forces that we've been talking about. And where my mind goes, and I'm curious for your perspective, is that there's so much to that question that it's not just about the efficiency that AI promises, but it's also about the high cost of delivering that AI. You know, how much processing power, how much energy, how many data centers, how much cooling water, how much all of that goes into one single query for AI, and we just haven't quite seen the return on investment yet. So I think we're in a tricky position in terms of not just tech brands, but any brand, any corporation trying to figure out what is the right way to use AI. But I'm curious for your prognostication on what are we really seeing happening in the corporate environment?
So I should preface this with I am not an economist. However, I read a lot about these things. So I think, as I mentioned kind of at the outset, the interplay of the trends is where a lot of the interesting magic happens. And so on one hand, you've got a little bit of the techno wonder, right? Where you're really excited about AI, but we're also really concerned about the personal things, like we might lose our job for that. And not just like we will lose our job and go across the street and do the same job for someone else who's hiring, but that our entire career path might vanish, right? These are very like empirical and also very personal concerns with technology. I think we're also seeing that a lot of corporate America is trying to find ways to grow as companies without necessarily growing their headcount. And that has interesting headwinds for the economy. And so I think we've seen some companies making announcements that aren't necessarily entirely related to the thing that has been blamed by, you know, the business press as the reason why things are happening. So earlier that was return to office was a way to do a quiet layoff by forcing everyone to come back, and those who couldn't, well, that's fine. I think AI is having some of that as well as we try and figure out how to find the ROI, how to figure out what is really going to change in terms of the needs of the workforce as some of these technologies come into place, and also just how it fits into our overall business strategy of how we continue to grow while also absorbing all these costs. And I think there's some interesting signals in the economy. I was just reading that data center construction is now a bigger part of the US GDP than consumer spending across all sectors, which is not typical in the US economy. Usually consumer spending is what is driving us. And so as all of these forces start to play out, it's going to be, I think, a really interesting couple of years to watch in this space.
Absolutely, and that's probably a good place to end, is watch with us and reach out to us if you have questions. We love, as you can tell, to talk about these kind of things, but happy to answer questions offline with anyone who we didn't get to. Ellen, I'll pass it back to you to close us out.
Well, thank you. A big thank you to Jennifer and Matt for today's really enlightening presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, we will do so by email. And I did see that there were quite a few. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation in the next few days. So please be on the lookout. And remember, there are handouts in the event console that you can download to read more about the research we shared. That now concludes today's amazing webinar. Have a wonderful day, guys.